The latest research from Redbridge Group has noticed similarities in the way Australian and American voters are responding to their major parties, unhappy with the cost of living, the housing crisis and the state of the healthcare system. More and more people are seeking alternative, disruptive solutions. Now, we're probably a long way off getting a figure like Donald Trump in power, but it seems like there is an appetite, even here in Australia, for someone who will disrupt the status quo. For more on this, I'm joined by Redbridge Group Director Simon Welsh. Simon, thanks so much for your time. Great to see you. Feels like ages since I've spoken to you, and actually feels like a long time since the US election, but that is certainly permeating through. A lot of people are wondering what the next 4 years look like. What do you think it will mean for us here in Australia?
That is a really good question, Laura. To be perfectly honest, I don't know. And the reason I don't know is I think the capability of Trump to hold this team together, to implement the things that he's said, I think there's a question mark on that. I think, you could take it one level and said, look, if he does this, and this, which is what he said, you could maybe sort of map out and make an argument for what that means for Australia. I think the capacity of him and his team to get things done is still a question mark. We saw that in the first presidency. Arguably, they're better, more organised this time round, but let's see. We're already hearing stories about trouble in paradise and the relationship between him and Musk. I think there's a lot of water under the bridge to go between the rhetoric and the implementation.
What are you picking up in the groups? Because, they want something disruptive, because essentially you've been telling us for a long time that voters are telling you that politics as it is just doesn't work for them. They're in the middle of the cost of living and housing crisis. So how does that shape our next election?
Yeah, this is really interesting. And this is where, as you sort of alluded to, there's some similarities with the US, but also some important differences. Certainly, we've watched now over the last sort of 12 months how housing crisis, cost of living crisis, health crisis, even climate crisis, they've all sort of merged into this one crisis of politics and economy. As you rightly say, the sense is that the economy's not working for us, the politics aren't working for us. The really interesting thing, and this is again where you sort of see the similarity with America, is that a lot of the folk that we are talking to, they don't know what the solution is. They don't have a sort of a vision or an outcome in mind of what is the answer to this problem. They're really looking for leadership to bring an alternative solution. And this is where the openness to sort of disruptive kind of approaches comes in. The difference with the US is that Australians tend to be very pragmatic about their disruption. So, the idea of a Trump-like figure that's just going to come in and just, wreck things and upturn the status quo actually doesn't excite Australian voters. There's a cohort that it does, and you sort of see that sort of hangs around on parties like One Nation and United Australia Party that sort of pick up a lot of that vote, but it's rarely above double figures. But most Australians sort of sit in this very pragmatic approach, which is, we want you to turn the sort of status quo upside down. That'd be great. But you've got to have pragmatic policies for how you're going to do that aren't going to sort of speak to an anxiety in people that, when they hear that sort of, populist sort of disruption and just upsetting the status quo for the sake of upsetting the status quo, what they hear is people getting hurt. What they fear is, is the uncertainty and the anxiety that comes with that. And sort of, I suppose, oddly in Australia at the moment, sort of the real example of this is actually the Greens Party. When we talk to people about Greens Party policy, a lot of those policies they really like. They like the sort of the progressive nature of those policies.
Sure.
But they don't like the Greens Party, because the Greens Party is seen as this kind of obstructionist, activist kind of entity, when actually what they're looking for is sort of a more sensible, pragmatic approach to actually implementing some of these policies. So there's this really Australian thing that sort of happens around. So while we talk about disruption, it's actually disruption in a very pragmatic, considered, and sort of leaning progressive kind of way for Australians.
Well, let's break this down a bit, because the Greens in the Queensland election didn't do very well at all. Voters, from what you're telling us, like the Greens' policies because they are disruptive. Let's take, rent control, for example. It's easy to understand. Is there something in that? The other thing about people crying out for leadership is I mean, they didn't want Scott Morrison. He was seen as too aggressive. They wanted to change from him. He was, in people's lives too much. They got Anthony Albanese, described as a bit more of a cuddly teddy bear. Now they seem to be thinking, oh, well, no, he's too soft. We want something a bit stronger than that. What do they want? Or don't they know?
Yeah, as I say, what the policy solutions to this is, people are waiting for our leaderships to fill in the blank. But certainly what they wanted from this government, the Albanese government, was change. That's what they were voting for. They were voting for change on these deeper economic and political sort of status quo, as it were. So I think what we're seeing at the moment a lot is incumbent governments that are just sort of running on a we'll keep things turning over business as usual kind of manner, are getting pounded in the polls. Sorry, not just in the polls, but in the vote at the booths. So what they're looking for, get the policy space. They need that space filled for them, but there is certainly this sense of we want people that are going to come in with pragmatic solutions for how do we change the status quo. And on the Albanese government, clearly there's a sense that they're not getting that at the moment.
Yeah, you said that almost a year ago that they need to start getting it, and they haven't. Election around the corner. Do they still have time, Simon?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really interesting question. My gut feel is probably not. I think things are probably baked in now because you reach this point in the electoral cycle where if you start to do disruptive, stuff, really good stuff now, people will say, well, why didn't you do that a year ago? Mm-hmm. The cynicism starts to become baked in, and that becomes really hard to punch through. No amount of campaign or communications or marketing will sort of punch through that cynicism. So I think probably the runway has run out. I think what we've seen now, the trends that we're seeing in the polls are probably baked in heading in towards the next election, which ultimately leads to the conclusion that the next election is going to be a mess. It is going to be all over the shop.
Great. Looking forward to it. Simon, thanks so much. We'll see you next week.